Today is December 1st, 2005. My name is Rosalind Ben-Jet. I'm here to take an oral interview with Mo Stein, and our videographer is Ruth Andrus. We're at the JCC building in the conference room. Mo, you're not from Dallas.
No, I'm a new American.
How did your parents get to Canada, and where did they come from?
Well, they arrived in Canada on December 31st, 1920. They landed in New Brunswick, in St. John's, New Brunswick. They came from Poland. They came with my grandfather, with my paternal grandfather. And my father, although Sean, had a sister in Toronto who wanted to bring my grandfather here. And my grandfather, who was widowed, wouldn't leave unless my father and mother came along with them. So that's how I managed to be here instead of in Poland. So they arrived in Toronto. My father was a watchmaker. He had a job, didn't like his boss, and moved after 6 weeks to Hamilton, Ontario, and he started work there, and shortly afterwards opened up his small watchmaking and jewelry store.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I'm here. I'm an only child, so.
So you were born in Hamilton?
I was born in Hamilton, Ontario.
Mm-hmm. And where did you lived in Hamilton during your childhood?
I grew up there, went all the way through high school there, and then went to Toronto for university. Came back after my first degree in chemical engineering. Worked for a few years and went back and went to the University of Toronto School of Social Work. And after I graduated there, I worked in Toronto for a few years.
At what?
Well, I started out as a BBYO director for 4 years, and then I went on to become what really amounts to being program director and some extra goodies for the city's largest conservative congregation at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was about 1,500 member congregation.
Mm-hmm. And when you were a child, did your family belong to a synagogue? How did they celebrate Jewish holidays?
Oh, well, yes, they belonged to a synagogue. My mother was president of the Ladies Auxiliary for a while. And Hamilton at that time was largely an immigrant community. Having said that, it also has the oldest continuous Reformed congregation in the country. So there was already a German Jewish population there, mostly native born, I think. Mm-hmm. Certainly not keeping itself somewhat distant from the rest of us who were immigrant kids, but most of them were immigrants. So we celebrated Jewish holidays by doing all the usual home rituals and by going to synagogue during the holidays. And what was typical there way back then, I'm now talking about the 30s and 40s, is most businessmen, practically all the Jewish businessmen, kept their businesses closed on every one of the holidays. And by that I mean Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shavuot, and Pesach.
Mm-hmm.
They literally kept their businesses closed for that.
And you mentioned that you worked with BBYO. Were you as a participant in any youth organizations when you were a teenager?
Yeah, I'm a graduate of AZA.
Mm-hmm. What kind of activities did you do in AZA?
Well, those of us who are my age and maybe 10 years younger will remember the Fivefold and Full program. In order to be a chapter in good standing, you had to have programs in all of those areas: social, athletic, religious, community service. So we had programs of all kinds. And as I think back, we did all kinds of things that we probably wouldn't allow teenagers to do today, not because they were bad, but because they were ambitious. We used to run big dances for the city. We used to run shows for the city. I'm talking about 15, 16, 17-year-old kids who did all that stuff. Run regional conventions with maybe one adult around for alleged supervision. So that's the kind of things we did.
And what were your interests when you were in high school?
What were my, geez, that's going back a long time. Probably photography, certainly very much involved in Jewish club activities. And reading. I was non-athletic, so I didn't participate much in that, and hanging around with my friends.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that your first degree was in chemical engineering.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, because I thought I wanted to be a great scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was pretty good in chemistry in high school and decided that was for me.
Mm-hmm.
Turned out it wasn't for me, but...
But did you finish?
Oh, yeah.
And that was at?
The University of Toronto.
University of Toronto. And were there other Jewish students at University of Toronto at that time?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. We had Toronto one of the things about the Jewish community anyway in Canada at that time was if you could afford to go to university at all, and if you were a good student, the tendency was to go to the local university if there was one. Mm-hmm. Hamilton had a small university that A, didn't have engineering, and B, was really a Methodist, I think, well, it was a religiously run university. It was a good school, but just didn't have the facilities or the programs. So we had a Hillel. I had relatives in Toronto that I lived with at the time. Yeah, we even had Jewish students in engineering.
Now, how did you discover that engineering was not for you?
Come on, it was easy. Number one, I graduated in 1946. It wasn't a very good year for Jewish engineering graduates to begin with, so it took me a while to find a job. I got a job with a Jewish company. But after 3-4 years of that, I really wasn't that good at it to begin with. I didn't enjoy it. I was very active in the Jewish Youth Center at home. I'd been active in Jewish groups since I was 7, really. And I really liked the work. And I found out that there was a profession. It wasn't just a case of being a nice person who was willing to work for hardly any money. I found out that there was a profession. It was social work. Mm-hmm. And I applied and I got into the School of Social Work.
Mm-hmm. And after you worked with BBYO, where did you go next?
I went to Bethesda Congregation, which is that very large conservative congregation in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And they ran all their programming material, everything from elementary school age kid clubs right up to their senior citizen club. I had all their, I had their youth congregation and their preschool congregation. They had a teen congregation. They had a dynamic rabbi. We had one of the early adult education programs in the community.
And after that?
After that, ambition called, and I really started looking for something that would not only have more meaning, but probably have more impact in the Jewish community. And as fortune had it, and it all depends on being in the right place at the right time, I got a job at what was then called the Jewish Community Council Director in Edmonton, Alberta,
Out in the west.
out in the west.
And what was it like there?
Well, it was a nice Jewish community. I had a secretary, so that was a whole staff. I really learned about fundraising there. I enjoyed the work. We were able to create some new programs. We were able to build a small Jewish youth center when I was during my time there, and we made some wonderful friends, some of which I still keep in touch with.
Now, you were married by then.
Yeah, we got married in 1955.
How did you meet your wife?
Well, the short story is she was a blind date that one of her friends who I knew from my college days told me about this friend of hers that was coming in from Winnipeg to start at the School of Library Science at the University of Toronto, and would I mind taking her out? And as a favor, I said yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
And
how that was it.
And where was she from?
She was from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
She was a graduate of the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
But she was from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Big city of 25,000 people at the time, and the Jewish community had dwindled from about 50 to 25 Jewish families.
What was the Jewish community like in Edmonton when you were there?
It was about 1,500 people, denominationally conservative, which we would probably, kind of conservatism there is, we would probably think of in terms of Tiferet Israel here, what's called traditional now in the United States, and an Orthodox shul. And all kind of strong Zionist community, strong young Judea. We had a Mizrahi, we had a lady, a Mizrahi auxiliary, we had a strong Hadassah, we had pioneer women, we had everything you could ask for, except we had a Talmud Torah at that time, the Jewish Day School, probably had 90 to 95% of the Jewish kids enrolled, which was typical of the Jewish communities in the prairies, in the prairies, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and Manitoba. It was a tight-knit Jewish community.
But you didn't stay that long.
I didn't. I stayed there 7 years.
Uh-huh.
And then we decided, it's time to move on to something bigger, to a larger Jewish community, just in order to be able
to advance your career.
To advance my career and be able to do more things. And we moved to Portland, Oregon. And we were there for 10 years. Wonderful Jewish community. Turned down some other jobs while I was there. And then Dallas came calling. And I said no twice.
While you were in Portland?
Well, yeah, it was important.
And do you remember what the circumstances were that when they came calling and how they courted you?
Well, again, I suppose it's hubris, because here it was in Portland, which really was a wonderful Jewish community, but again, because of its size and because of its location, being on the West Coast, in the Northwest, perhaps somewhat limiting in terms of what could be accomplished. I got a call one day from the person at the Council of Jewish Federation, said somebody wanted to talk to me, and I get this husky voice. This is Fanny Shane, and you know who I am. Do I know who she is? You know, she's Mrs. UJ, probably for half the country. She's the vice president of the Council of Jewish Federations. I've seen her up front at all kinds of conferences. Bernie, we had brought Bernie into town to do some soliciting for us. Do I know who she was? Anyway, visited, was interesting. We really didn't want to go because of where our kids were at school and so forth. And it went back and forth like that. And one day, Arnie Sweet, and we certainly weren't going to move that year. And Arnie Sweet called. And he spent an hour and a half. I can still remember, I was out gardening, which is one of the things you can do in Portland. And Arnie calls and we go over, he's got me on the phone for a year. We'll wait a year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's worth it. These are all the great opportunities. You know, he paints this glorious picture of a sky's the limit can-do community, and mentions some other opportunities, things that are going on in the community with the building of the new JCC, and they were talking about the possibility of building Echad. And finally, we succumbed, Lil and I, Lil Lashon, my wife, and I succumbed, finally agreed that maybe it would be worthwhile to come. So I actually agreed to come. It was a crazy situation in 1976, but that I wouldn't start until 1977.
Because of your children's
Because
situation?
of children's, because of some obligations that I felt I still had. There were things that I really wanted to finish and never really did because of time in Portland. Mm-hmm. And we came.
Mm-hmm. And what was Dallas like when you came?
That's an interesting story because I'm so impressed by what Dallas has become. It was still living down the Kennedy assassination. As a matter of fact, some of my friends that I spoke with, saying that I told that I was going to come to Dallas, said, "Why do you want to go there?" So that was going on. It was just starting to build this Jewish Community Center building. There was still, in my opinion, a divide between Reform and most everybody else in this town. I was taken aback because it was so vastly different from what I'd known in Canada, mm-hmm. wherever I lived, that the Jewish community was divided by congregational affiliation, and that people from Congregation A really didn't know people from Congregation B, and sure as heck didn't know anything about Congregation B. There was the what we would today call the pro-Israel, but was then called the Zionists and the non-Zionists. There was still the skepticism about Akiba. We met some very, very nice people. The people were nice, the people that were active. Maury Neuberger had just assumed the presidency. I came in expecting Stanley Pearl to be my president, and he was for 3 days. And Maury and I had some things that we certainly agreed on and wanted to do. So there was a lot of excitement, and you get kind of caught up in the job. And Jerome, our son, was off in his first year at university. The first year we lived here at the University of Washington. It was the University of Washington. And our daughter, Deborah, was going to enter her senior year at Richardson High, when Richardson High was considered the high school in the area at that time. So that was going on. You wouldn't recognize, I don't think, 1977 Dallas today. There's the change over these, 28, 29 years is just, in the Jewish community, has just been fantastic.
What do you think the changes have been?
In the Jewish community?
In the Jewish community.
Yeah. Well, there's a much greater assertiveness, if you will, about being Jewish than there was then. If you take a look at what's happened to the Jewish day school situation, we had one struggling Jewish day school, Akiba. Today, what are there? 5? Akiba, Levine, Torah Day School, Masorah High, Yavna.
And then there's a boys.
And then there's the
something.
one at Ohev Shalom, the boys yeshiva.
And Wise Academy.
Beg your pardon?
And Wise Academy.
And Wise Academy, pardon me. The idea,
Solomon Schechter?
that's
Now
Levine
Levine
Academy.
Academy.
Levine Academy, yeah, Solomon Schechter and Levine Academy.
It's now Levine Academy.
Yeah, the Nate and Ann Levine Academy, or Ann and Nate Levine Academy. There's something like over 1,000 Jewish kids in day schools. That's unthinkable. That would have been that would have been more than unthinkable. They would have told you were out of your mind in those days, right? And as far as congregations, I think the count now is something like 18 or 19, if you can. There was no Lubavitch when we came, and when Mendel Dubrovsky came, probably around 1980 or thereabouts. Everybody thought he was crazy. Now there's 3 Lubavitch operations. There's been a growth in the Orthodox community. There's certainly still a very strong Reform community where Beth Torah was already started. So we've grown to 3 conservative congregations, and there's all kinds of smaller Orthodox congregations. You wouldn't have seen people going around with yarmulkes and black hats up and down the street. And as far as I know, few, if any, of us acclimated Jews wince when we see them. There's an interest in the Jewish community that in the non-Jewish community, I think we've grown substantially.
In more than numbers.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We did the, I guess it was a second scientific population study in 1989, 90, where we really got I think we got the first real fix on the community, knowing who we were, how big we were, where we were, what we did, what we didn't do.
What were the challenges that you faced when you came to Federation?
I got to Federation, I think it was the year after it had one of its better fundraising campaigns. And the year I got there, the economy went down, had one of its dips, and it was the first year, I think, probably since before the 6-Day War that a campaign went down, and people really worked their hearts out. had to initiate that's when we really started, in my opinion, a very good planning process, because planning was kind of hit and miss, and that was a matter of luck as much as anything else. Herb Schorl Shalom said, used to say, whenever you want to set up a study committee, it was to get something out of the way. Well, the year I came, the planning committee had started thinking about housing for the poor, well elderly. That was the year we really got serious about it, and they started to work on what was to become Echad. That came out of that planning process. We took a look at Carmen Michael, I forget who came with her, came and asked about doing something for mentally retarded adults, setting up a group home. And we did a lot of back and forthing, but it started in the planning committee and eventually got accepted by the board. Community relations, which had been a long-standing program, but the year before I came, they had finally agreed to take on a community relations director. And I hired Emily Fink. So that's when we really started doing some very serious work in community relations. There had been an ongoing program, but again, it was largely handled by volunteers with minimal professional assistance. We came into when I came in, there was a financial reporting system that was probably great for the 1950s, but had to be ramped up and really improved. We did that, and then we started a long, hard trail to begin automating our system. But it started automation, but it was really not that good a program when we did that. So there were, and then, in my opinion, and maybe one of the things that I think I managed to help do was really give the organization back to the board. Really get the board of directors not only involved, but to assume much more responsibility than they had the opportunity to before.
The former director didn't?
No, well, the nonprofit management and governance has really gone through a lot of changes since the 1950s. It used to be a few people making major decisions, maybe working together with an executive, maybe an executive that participated in directing policy, and boards voting things up or down, and that was about it. I was lucky enough to have a group of presidents who really knew how to do two things: was take control of a meeting, but really permit discussion. So I was lucky to have that group of presidents. But those are some of the things that had to happen. I think we developed a federation that was much more responsive to the community.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of little things.
Like?
Sending a thank you letter to people for making a contribution to the campaign.
Mm-hmm. And we think of that as pretty basic today.
Yeah, well, it wasn't thought of as being pretty basic, you know. One of the responses from somebody, what do you want to do that for? Or what do you need to do that for? The times had changed.
Mm-hmm.
We brought a lot of younger people onto the board. My impression was, and we managed to change that fairly early on, is if you looked at the board of the Dallas Federation, it was almost like there were slots for certain families. And positions on the board came by inheritance. Now, they were good people, but it began to look, it certainly, I would imagine that to an outsider, it would have looked to as if it was a bunch of cliques.
Mhm.
So we finally passed a resolution that you couldn't have husband and wife on the board, or father and child on the board, except in unusual circumstances. That was we modernized, we revamped, we did a lot of stuff.
Mhm. Are there other ways that the Jewish community then evolved while you were with Federation?
Well, Golden Acres certainly grew. It grew by pieces, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but by the time we were finished, it was up to 270 beds. Jewish Family Service had to respond to a whole new set of needs. Oh, the other thing, of course, that happened was the Operation Exodus. The whole Russian Jewish Soviet Jewish immigration thing was fantastic. It started in a serious way, in a really serious way, in terms of taking in more, agreeing to accept more Russian immigrants, and in terms of raising more money. The last year I was here, and it went into the year after I left pretty well. This community raised, as I recall, over $5 million, close to $6 million, just for the Soviet resettlement, for here and in Israel.
What year would that have been?
That was
approximately?
1990.
Mhm.
I retired in January of 91. So it was that last year, maybe 89, we got started.
Mhm.
The Russians drifting in before that, and there had been the influx in the early 1970s, but nothing compared to what it became.
Right.
So that changed agencies all over the place.
And do you think that the community bought into supporting this project?
Oh yeah, there were volunteers all over the place. Tremendous number of
I
volunteers.
was one of them.
Yeah. You speak to all kinds of people. You were one of them. You were one of them in helping them find their apartments. You were one of them in terms of helping them, taking them shopping. You were one of them helping them with English as second language. There was one of them guiding them through the government mazes here. Oh yeah.
Now, since you've been retired, though, you have a new degree.
That's
and
right.
a new profession in retirement. Tell us about that.
Well, I guess I had always kind of wanted a doctorate because I knew people who got doctorates, and because I guess part of it was I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. And I was always interested in learning. So after I retired, well, Lil had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1981. And by the time I retired, well, she was still functioning pretty well. I thought after a year or two of doing, we did some traveling, I'd like to go back to school. So in '93, I took some courses. I went to UTD, and I didn't want a doctorate in social work. I figured that's not what I wanted. So social psychology made sense to me because it was pretty close to what I was doing. And I went to university, and they said, well, we don't have a course in social science. They sent me over to school of social science. So they said, we don't have a course in social psychology, but we got something that isn't too far away. It's political economy. And, you know, it has something to do with nonprofit groups too. Maybe you would be interested in this. So I figured, what have I got to lose? Let me look at it. Well, will you let me in? Yeah, they let me in. They got me credits for my master's degree in social work. I didn't have to write the GREs because I already had an exam. So I took some courses. Lil got too sick for me to really keep going to school because, as you know, Roz Benjet, a doctoral course takes a lot of hard work.
It certainly does. No question about that.
Takes a lot of hard work. So I became a caregiver, and Lil passed away in '96, and I went back in the fall of that year. She passed away in March. And I got a degree in a doctorate in political economy. My concentration is what they would call human resources. And my real interest was in, I had my real interest was in nonprofit organizations. And my secondary interest was in health policy because of what we had gone through with Lil, dealing with the medical health policies in this country. And then I lucked out. I succeeded Walter Levy, who had been my predecessor at the Federation, to follow him as director or consultant to the Feldman Family Foundation, which is kind of reviewing grants and making recommendations. And then a year after I got my degree, the wonderful person who was teaching nonprofit organization left to go to the University of Indiana, which is one of the premier schools in that whole field. So I got the job offer because I had my PhD and I had practical experience. That was a terrific combination. So I've been teaching that once a year for the last 5 years. Nonprofit organization and public policy.
And how do you like the students?
Well, I like the students, and I certainly want my goal is to help them learn. I like the students. You know, there's the odd one who drives you crazy, not because of their behavior, but because of their seeming inattention to stuff.
These are graduate
This is graduate school. This isn't graduate school. And I've had some remarkably bright people.
And if you were going to think about who your mentors were when you came to Dallas, who do you think they would have been?
I'd put Leon Rabin, although Shalom, at the top of the list. I really would.
Why?
Well, Leon was an incredibly bright man with real insight. He was a good thinker. He was a guy who saw what was going on in the community and going on in society. He was willing to look at new ways of doing things. He was willing. He recognized change. He recognized the shortcomings. He recognized weaknesses in whatever organization he was in, by the way. Whether it was, he was certainly a stalwart of American Jewish Committee, and he was not afraid to tell you what he thought. Had this wonderful sense of humor, and he had some great aphorisms too. I would have lunch with Leon at least once a month.
Mhm. What do you think the future holds for the Dallas Jewish community?
Well, I think that we have got to learn how to respect one another's Jewish religious practices and beliefs. I think we still have some way to go to understanding one another. I'm talking about denominationally. I think we've got to view the community. We've got to view the community not as a homogeneous entity, but one with an awful lot of sectors, and really help those sectors come together, not so that they will be merged, but on the contrary, again, so that they will learn to understand each other and to respect one another. I think that if there's still a secular, I'm talking now organizationally, if there's still a secular religious divide, kind of what would I call it? A shul state divide, that's got to be bridged.
Mhm.
That's got to be bridged. I think that there's got to be a willingness for experimentation. I think we tend to be, all of us, too conservative, and I'm not leaving myself out of that. I think there's got to be the willingness to try new things and not to be too, I'm not talking about gambling, I'm not talking about needless risk-taking, but I think there's a need to risk, and failure is not the end of the world. You know, my favorite story when I tell people is, do you know who the best batter was in modern baseball history? That was Ted Williams. And you know what his average was? In his best year was .401. That means he missed 6 out of 10 tries. But if he hadn't tried, he wouldn't have hit those 4. We're not quite ready, I think, to do that. I think there's going to have to be an awful lot more of that. We've got, as a Jewish community, we've really got to learn how to, I'll use business terminology, how first to keep the customers we have, and secondly, to work a little bit smarter at finding, I don't mean new Jews, I mean to keep more Jews involved in being Jewish. Because in my opinion, well, first of all, I think that Judaism is an important part of being Jewish, but my secular friends won't agree with me. But even my secular friends will agree with me that it's important to have a connection to the Jewish community. And there aren't enough people with those connections today. We need more.
Mhm. What are you most proud of your accomplishments?
I don't know, that's a good question. I think I had some small part to play in the acceptance of Jewish education by the Federation. I think that's terribly important. I think I'm proud of the fact in the way in which I gave the organization back to the board and created a big board. I think we created a more accessible federation. I'm proud that we let the agencies grow and to develop new services for the Jewish community. I don't know, it's up to others to decide what's good and what really doesn't matter.
Tell us about your family today.
Ah, my family today. Well, I've already implied that I lost Lil in '96. I have a son and a daughter. My son is Jerome, 47, very active at the Jewish Community Center, very active as an actor around the community. I don't mean the Jewish community, I mean around Dallas. He's a lawyer. That's his day job. His wife is Susan. She's a graphic artist. And their two children are Jordan, who just turned 12, and is now spent her first. All of my grandkids went to preschool at the Jewish Community Center, had a great experience. Jordan spent first 5 years at Solomon Schechter. I'm sorry, first 5 years at Solomon Schechter. She's now a 6th grader at Frankfurt in the Plano School District. Her brother Reed is 10, and he's at Schechter, now called Levine, in 4th grade. And Deborah, my daughter, just turned 45. She's a single mother. She has a son, Mika, for Mikael, who just turned 11, and he is now at Levine, formerly Schechter, and spent the first, trying to remember where he went to kindergarten. Went to kindergarten here at the JCC. Spent his first 3 years at Wise Academy. Now, Deborah's a school teacher, and she taught at Wise Academy for 3 years. She now teaches English, language arts, I think it's called, language arts, to 9th graders at Hillcrest High School. All 3 grandchildren are really good students, and they're good kids, and everyone is different from the other. And they all live here, which is the greatest thing in the world.
Oh, yeah.
So that, if you ask me what I'm proudest of, that's what I'm proudest of.
Mhm. Is there anything that you want to add that I didn't think about?
I don't know what was missing. I think we covered pretty well everything.
Mhm.
The rest would just be more pontificating, and you don't need that.
I am curious.
Thank you.
What are some suggestions of the direction you'd like to see the Dallas Jewish community go? You said some of the problems.
Well, what would I like? I think what I presented as problems, just turn them around.
Okay.
Let's figure out ways of really communicating with one another. Let's figure out ways that will keep us more Jewish in the widest definition of the term. The simplest way I know how to put it is, how do we make sure, what do we do to make sure that in our grandchildren's generation and in our great-grandchildren's separation, there's an identifiable Jewish community here that is distinguishable from any other group in the city? How do you know that they're Jewish, really Jewish? You don't have to be Jewish to like Levy's rye bread.
Thank you very much. That's a great ending.
Okay.
We will. Today is March 13th, 2006. I'm Rosalind Ben-Jet, and I'm here talking to Mo Stein, and our videographer is Leslie Wagner. Mo, the last time we talked about you had retired at the end of 1990, and you went on to several different careers. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I went on to get my doctorate at and I wound up teaching a nonprofit organization in the graduate school at the University of Texas at Dallas. I became consultant to the Feldman Foundation. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of, or feel lucky enough to have been able to do, is to be part of the founding of the Beit Midrash of North Texas, which is an independent, non-denominational, multi-denominational, pluralist. We haven't figured out the right word yet. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Adult Jewish egalitarian adult Jewish education organization. It was an idea that was originally born by, as a result of two separate things that were happening with ideas started by Rabbi Jordan Ofsayer at Shearith Israel and Rabbi Nancy Kasten in the Reform movement. And eventually they asked me to come in and work with them. And the result was the creation of the Beit Midrash. By independent, we mean that it's not affiliated with any religious movement. It's not affiliated with any other organization, either nationally or in the community. By non-denominational, interdenominational, however you want to state it, it means that we don't try to promote any particular stream of Judaism. And as far as possible, we like to talk or explain as much as we possibly can about the various Jewish approaches to some issues. So our teachers, and the other thing that we stress is that we build on, we don't try to compete with what's going on in other adult education activities in the community. What we try to build on them, supplement them, so we're kind of advanced. If you look at us in comparison to most of what's going on in the community, we're kind of the college edition. So our teachers are either have to be academicians that are expert in a particular field that they're going to teach, like for instance, like philosophy or in Holocaust, or if they're rabbis, they have to be expert in the particular thing that they're teaching, whether it's halakha, whether it's history, and so forth. So our teachers have to meet our standards. The organization is lay-driven. Our programs are not single-shot events, but they tend to be courses that run over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, or 6 to 12 weeks, as a matter of fact. And we've done a variety of things, all the way from halakha to Holocaust, to Jewish, to the literature of the Holocaust, to Jewish history. Our teachers have come from Reform, Orthodox, and conservative rabbis. We have a number of professors that are college professors that have taught for us. We managed to get about 50 or 60 students enrolled in each of our terms. We run on the basis of fall and spring terms. And our challenge is constantly to raise enough money to be able to do what we do.
The challenge of all nonprofits.
Right. And if my perception is correct, we're still in the business of trying to build a constituency for adult Jewish education. The reason I'm so interested is because I think in our need to perpetuate or to continue Judaism in the 21st century, a Jewish community that's literally, that's got Judaic proficiency in the 21st century, we really have to educate our adults as well as our children. I think the community's come a long, long way still has a way to go in terms of training teaching its children. We've got a long way to go with college students, and we've got an even longer way to go with adults. If for no other reason, then if education, if the Jewish tradition or Jewish continuity is carried along through the home, then our parents and our grandparents have to be able to teach our children and grandchildren as well. That's why I think it's so important.
And how do you think the organization of Bede, do you think it changed adult Jewish education in Dallas any since Midrash has started?
Well, that depends on how many people know about it. But what we found is that we get a number of students who have gone through Melton, which is a fine program, or have studied with their congregations or with the American Jewish Committee, that really find that what they're getting is what in today's world we would call added value. Our teachers like teaching for us because they're not constrained by any particular curriculum. They can teach what they really want to teach and what they're interested in. And they like the response that they get from our students, because the students really want to learn. With maybe one possible exception, our work is almost exclusively seminar style, where there's a lot of interaction between students and between teachers. So it's really learning. So I guess if I wanted to stretch things, it would be as close as possible as you can get to chavrusa education, chavruta, where there's a dialogue between people.
Two people. Do you think that this will change in the future when there are more graduates of Jewish day schools who become parents and adults?
Well, that people will continue their education? Yeah. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. You know, I'm old enough to remember that when they were starting to create the whole idea of Jewish day school, and they would talk to parents, and the response was, well, you want my kid to be a rabbi? As if that was all that was necessary to know. There's a lot we have to learn. Mm-hmm. We're probably the most well-educated. Jews are, without doubt, the best educated subgroup in the United States today, and Jewishly we're really illiterate.
Is there anything you would like to add?
No, let's keep learning. Learning, Roz, as you know, is a lifetime proposition.
That's for sure.
There's a lot more that we don't know than what we do know.
Okay. Anything you want to say
No.
in addition? Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, was that all right?